So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about what Iran just did. Everyone is watching the reaction from Washington. Everyone is watching the military analysts on television. Everyone is watching the UN statements and the diplomatic back and forth, but almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people around the world. Why did America say nothing? And what does that silence actually mean? Because here's what most coverage is not telling you. When a nation as significant as Iran shifts its position at dawn, quietly, deliberately, without fanfare, and the most powerful military and economic force in the world responds with complete silence, that is not an absence of policy. That is a policy. And understanding what that policy is will tell you more about where the world is heading than anything else you will read this week. The answer, when you look at it carefully, is that America's silence is the signal of something much bigger than one diplomatic moment. It is the signal that the old rules of how great powers interact, rules that governed your energy bill, your food prices, your job security, and your savings are being rewritten right now. Depending on where you live, your life is already being affected in ways you may not yet recognize. So today I want to walk you through exactly what Iran shifted, why America stayed silent, what that silence means for every major power on earth, and what it means for you, part by part, step by step. And so let us begin. The first thing you need to understand, the foundation of everything else I'm going to tell you today is this. The global order that has governed energy, trade, and military power for the past half-century was never just about missiles and diplomacy. It was about rules. Unspoken rules. Rules about who gets to act, who has to react, and who sets the terms for everyone else. For 40 years, those rules were simple. America acts, everyone else responds. America sets sanctions, everyone else complies or pays a price. America deploys its military. Everyone else adjusts their position. That is how the system worked. And it worked because the US dollar underpinned almost every major transaction in the global economy. When you control the currency that the world needs to buy energy, you control the rules. What Iran did at dawn was not a military strike. It was not a diplomatic statement. It was a structural maneuver. A move designed to test whether America would defend those rules or whether the silence would confirm what many nations have quietly suspected for years, that the rules are no longer as enforceable as they once were. The question is no longer whether America is the world's dominant power. Nobody serious is arguing that it is not. The question is whether American dominance is absolute enough to prevent other nations from building a parallel system. A system where American rules simply do not apply. The answer to that question depends entirely on one thing: whether the silence America chose was strength or hesitation. Because for every nation watching right now, and every major nation is watching, the interpretation of that silence will shape their next move. The more nations read it as hesitation, the faster the alternative system grows. The more nations read it as calculated patience, the more cautious they will remain. Let me walk you through every major player in this situation with that framework in mind. On the surface, Iran looks like a nation that has been cornered. Decades of sanctions, a currency that has collapsed in value, an economy that has struggled to access global markets, a population that has grown frustrated with the pace of change. On the surface, Iran looks like it is running out of options. But underneath that surface, Iran just demonstrated something that its leadership has been building toward for years. The ability to act unilaterally in a way that forces every other major power to respond without firing a single shot. What Iran shifted at dawn was its formal posture within the emerging non-dollar trade architecture. Iran signaled, through a combination of energy agreements, regional positioning, and direct coordination with specific allies, that is no longer operating within the boundaries that American sanctions were designed to enforce. It is not breaking those rules loudly, it is simply functioning outside them. The specific numbers matter here. Iran currently exports an estimated 1.5 million barrels of oil per day, most of it to China, purchased in yuan rather than dollars. That is not a small transaction. That is roughly 1.5% of global daily oil supply moving completely outside the dollar system. That percentage does not sound alarming, but it is growing. And the direction of growth matters more than the current size. For ordinary Iranian families, this does not immediately translate into lower prices at the market or more stability in their daily lives. The economic pain from decades of sanctions is real and deep. But for the Iranian government, this move represents a long-term bet that a world with an alternative financial system is a world where Iran can eventually function normally. The Dawn move was not about today, and it was about positioning for the decade ahead. Now let us look at the nation whose silence defined the morning. On the surface, America looks like the undisputed architect of the global order. Its military has no equal. Its economy remains the largest on Earth. Its currency is used in an estimated 88% of all global foreign exchange transactions. America does not look like a nation that needs to hesitate, but underneath that surface, America is managing a set of constraints that make the calculus of responding to Iran significantly more complicated than it was 20 years ago. America is carrying $39 trillion in national debt. $39 trillion. And the financial mechanism that allows America to sustain that debt, the petrodollar system, where oil is priced in dollars and dollar demand stays permanently elevated, is precisely what Iran's move is slowly targeting. A full military or economic escalation against Iran risks triggering an energy price shock that would land directly on American households. Higher gas prices, higher food costs, higher inflation across the board. And here is the second constraint. America's closest allies in Europe are in the middle of their own energy cost crisis, still recovering from the shock of the Ukraine war. A new Gulf escalation that drives energy prices sharply higher would pose serious political damage to governments across Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Governments that America needs as partners. So when America stayed silent at dawn, the silence was not absence of awareness. It was the sound of a great power weighing costs that previous generations of American policymakers did not have to weigh in. The same way the debt is real, the alliance fragility is real, the energy price sensitivity of ordinary American families whose job, savings, and energy bill are all downstream of these decisions is real. America is still better positioned than almost any other nation to navigate this period. Its Western Hemisphere resources, oil, gas, agricultural land, fresh water, give it options that most countries simply do not have. But the silence at dawn was a reminder that even the world's dominant power now operates within limits. And those limits are exactly what Iran was testing. On the surface, China looks like a nation under significant economic strain. Its property sector has been in crisis for years. Its consumer spending is weak. Its export markets are facing tariffs and trade barriers from the United States and Europe. Its demographic picture, a rapidly aging population, presents serious long-term challenges. But underneath that surface, China's been doing something that requires decades of patience to execute, and that most Western analysts consistently underestimate: building the infrastructure for a parallel global economic system. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy from the Gulf region. That dependence on Gulf energy is the single greatest vulnerability in China's long-term strategic position. China knows this. It has known it for 20 years. And the Belt and Road Initiative, the yuan-based oil settlement system, the $400 billion Iran partnership, and the quiet accumulation of trade agreements across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. All of it is the response to that one vulnerability. When Iran moved at dawn, China did not react with alarm. China reacted with what can only be described as quiet confirmation. This is the moment China has been structurally preparing for. Not because China wanted instability in the Gulf. Instability disrupts the energy supply China depends on, but because Iran's willingness to operate openly outside the dollar system is the proof of concept that China's alternative architecture actually works. For ordinary Chinese families, none of this feels like a geopolitical victory. They are dealing with high youth unemployment, a weak property market, and uncertainty about the economic future. Chinese household savings rates remain elevated, meaning people are holding their money rather than spending it, which tells you everything about how confident ordinary Chinese people feel. But for China's government, the dawn move by Iran was the clearest signal yet that the long game is playing out on schedule. Now let us look at the nations caught in the middle of this transition and what it means for their people. On the surface, Russia looks like a nation under enormous economic and military pressure. Its currency has been destabilized. Its economy has been cut off from Western financial markets. Its military is engaged in a costly and grinding conflict in Ukraine. Russia does not look like a winner in the current global environment. But underneath that surface, Russia is one of the quiet beneficiaries of every move Iran makes that erodes the dollar-based system, because Russia has been operating outside that system by necessity since 2022. Russia currently exports significant volumes of oil and gas to China and India, settled in currencies other than the dollar. Russia's forced exclusion from SWIFT, the global financial messaging system that dollar transactions run through, pushed it to develop alternative payment channels at speed. Those channels are now functional, and every nation that follows a similar path makes Russia's isolated position slightly less isolated. The specific number to hold on to here is this. The combined oil exports of Russia and Iran, primarily flowing to China and India in non-dollar currencies, now represent an estimated 10 to 12% of global oil. Trade operating outside the traditional dollar settlement system, 3 years ago, that number was effectively zero. The direction of that trend is what matters. For ordinary Russian families, none of this strategic repositioning has made daily life easier. Inflation is real, imported goods are more expensive, economic uncertainty is pervasive. But Russia's government now has a functioning model for economic survival outside the Western-led system. And Iran's dawn move makes that model more viable, not less. Now, let us look at the nations this transition threatens most directly, and what their silence on the global stage actually costs them. On the surface, India looks like one of the world's great economic success stories. The fastest growing large economy on earth, a young population, a booming technology sector, a manufacturing base that global companies are actively building as an alternative to China. But underneath that surface, India imports approximately 60% of its oil from the Gulf region. 60%, that is a dependence that places India directly in the path of any Gulf disruption. At exactly the moment, India was positioning itself for its most ambitious period of economic growth. India has been walking a careful diplomatic line. It has maintained trade relationships with Russia. It has not joined Western sanction regimes against either Russia or Iran. It has been quietly buying discounted Russian oil while simultaneously deepening its economic partnership with the United States. India is hedging and doing it skillfully. But when Iran shifts its position and America stays silent, India faces a more acute version of the choice that every middle power is now navigating. Which system do you build your future into? Because the cost of being on the wrong side of this transition, of having built your infrastructure, your contracts, and your financial relationships into a system that is being structurally undermined, is a cost that arrives slowly and then all at once. For the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, the picture is equally complex. These nations built their entire modern identity on two foundations: petrodollar wealth and American military protection. Both of those foundations are now showing cracks. Saudi Arabia has been quietly expanding its ties with China. The UAE has been positioning itself as a neutral financial hub accessible to both systems. These are not hostile acts toward America, they are hedges. For ordinary families across the Gulf and across India, the dawn move by Iran and America's silence are reminders that the world their parents built their lives around is changing. The question is how fast, and whether their governments are moving quickly enough to position them for what comes next. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because when you step back from the individual actors, Iran, America, China, Russia, India, the Gulf states, you see something that none of the individual stories fully reveals on its own. You see a pattern, a structural shift that is happening simultaneously across every major region of the world, driven by the same underlying force. For 40 years, the global order operated on what you might call the confidence architecture. It was not just the dollar. It was not just American military power. It was the confidence shared by almost every government on Earth that the American-led system was the only system that worked at scale, that there was no credible alternative, that the cost of operating outside American rules was simply too high for any serious nation to pay. Iran's dawn move and America's silence in response is chipping away at that confidence architecture, not destroying it, not yet, and perhaps not ever completely, but introducing doubt where certainty used to live. And in geopolitics, as in finance, doubt is contagious. And here's the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. The threat to American dominance is not military. America's military superiority is not in question. The threat is financial and psychological. It is the slow accumulation of moments where nations look at the American-led system, calculate the cost and the benefit, and decide to quietly build an exit, not because they have already committed to leaving, but because they want the option to leave. That is what Iran gave every wavering nation this morning. An option, a proof of concept, a demonstration that a nation can shift its position at dawn, wait for the silence, and continue functioning. The nations that will navigate the coming decade most successfully are not necessarily the ones with the most military power or the most resources. They are the ones that read this moment correctly, that understand the confidence architectures under pressure and position themselves accordingly, not by choosing sides, but by understanding which systems are gaining credibility and which are losing it. That is the real story behind the silence, and it is a story that will be unfolding for years. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion of this entire analysis. You might expect me to say that the biggest loser here is America. America stayed silent. America's system is being challenged. America's debt is a vulnerability. Surely, America is the one that comes out of this moment diminished. But actually, no. The biggest loser in what happened this morning is not America. It is the nations that built their entire modern existence on the assumption that the American-led order was permanent and never built any alternative plan. Think about which nations. That describes nations that structured their entire economies around dollar-denominated trade and never developed the infrastructure to operate differently. Nations that accepted American military protection as a permanent guarantee and never built independent defense capabilities. Nations that built their financial systems as extensions of Western banking architecture and have no fallback if that architecture becomes contested. For those nations, and there are many of them across the Middle East, across parts of Africa, across parts of Southeast Asia, the dawn move by Iran is not a source of hope. It is a source of anxiety because they are not positioned to benefit from an alternative system. They are not positioned to navigate a transition. They are simply exposed. The nations that are actually best positioned right now are the ones that have been quietly building optionality for years. Nations that trade in multiple currencies. Nations that have infrastructure relationships with both Western and non-Western. Partners, nations that have not committed exclusively to either system and therefore have room to maneuver as the situation develops. That is the hard lesson of this morning. The silence was not just about Iran and America. It was a test of every nation's strategic flexibility. And the nations that will look back on this period as the beginning of their best decade are the ones that already had that flexibility, not the ones that assumed the old rules would last forever. Resilience is not weakness. Preparation is not disloyalty. Understanding that the world is changing is not pessimism. It is wisdom. So let us just recap what we covered today. Iran moved at dawn, not with a missile, but with a structural maneuver designed to demonstrate that operating outside the dollar system is now viable for a major energy exporter. America stayed silent, not out of ignorance, but out of calculation. The $39 trillion debt, allied fragility in Europe, and energy price sensitivity at home all make full escalation more costly than it was in previous decades. China is the patient architect of this transition. Having spent 20 years building the infrastructure for a parallel economic system and now watching that infrastructure gain real-world validation. Russia is the quiet beneficiary. Its forced exclusion from the dollar system in 2022 gave it experience that is now proving to be strategic preparation rather than just punishment. India and the Gulf states are navigating the most difficult middle position. Too integrated into the old system to leave easily, too aware of the transition to ignore it entirely. And the biggest losers are not the powerful nations managing this transition. They are the smaller, exposed nations that built everything on the assumption that the old rules were permanent and never built any flexibility into their position. This is not a story about one morning's news cycle. This is a story about the slow rewriting of the rules that govern your energy costs, your food prices, your job security, and your savings. The silence at dawn was the signal. The transition is already underway. The question is not whether this shift is coming, it is already here. The question is whether the people and the nations paying attention today will be better positioned than those who are not. Subscribe for more analysis of the major shifts shaping our world, explained in simple English. And tell me in the comments, do you think America's silence was a sign of strength and calculated patience, or a sign that the old rules no longer carry the same weight? So I will see you next time.